This podcast is brought to you by GeekNuck.com and their Intel Serpent Canyon NUC 12 that comes with an i7 and A770M in a compact little workstation. Support Moore's Law is Dead and get $50 off by using the offer code MLID50. But also support Moore's Law is Dead by using the offer code Broken Silicon for 10% off Vite Ramen, or the offer code Broken Silicon for 25% off all Windows keys at cdkeyoffer.com. You can also use DieShrink to get 3% off everything else on that website, and we'll talk about these supporters later. But for now, let's just get on with the show. And welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom, and today I'm having on a guest that I guess I didn't even really know I was interested in having on. But if I look back at the history of Broken Silicon, I can honest to God say that like 1 out of 5 of the guests, at least 20%, maybe a fourth, are guests that I never knew was a thing I would want to have on, or didn't realize this was a type of job. This is the type of thing where I kind of knew it was out there, but knew basically nothing about it. But anytime we can have on an expert, someone who actually does stuff with the hardware we argue about online all the time, not just for gaming, but in the professional fields where people are willing to pay 10 times as much because it actually is making them money. I think it's interesting because these professional uses of the products we talk about from day to day are the things actually dictating the decisions these companies make when they release products. Most of the time, it's not for gaming. It's for something where someone paid thousands of dollars so they could make something that will make them money. And, well, that's what we're talking about today. But so please, guest, introduce yourself. Tell everybody who you are, what you do, what got you into that line of work, and really just as much or as little about yourself as you're comfortable saying.
Okay. Hey, Tom. My name's Vin Corigliano. I am the owner of Avum Technology, which is in Melbourne, Australia. Now, Avum Technology is a company that specialises in professional PC workstation solutions for digital audio and music production. That's probably the best way for me to explain what the company does. Digital audio workstations can also be called DAWs or DAWs. I'm also the founder of DawBench, which was originally my blog site for just writing about comparative DAW performance and how. So I developed a couple of DAW benchmark sessions. These are specific tests that allow us to test the scaling performance of native DAWs as the CPU architectures were progressing. So we went from the single core, dual core, quad, and now we're up to the higher core counts now. So I've been tracking that since about 2005. So we're about the 18th year with DawBench. And I've been, sharing a lot of internal IP over the years, and with that, and there's a lot of reports online as well. I've handed over a lot of the comparative CPU testing to a colleague and test partner of mine who is Pete Kane from Scan in UK. I mean, he has access to a far wider range of CPUs, and he has early access to a lot of this stuff as well, which comes in quite handy, especially that I used to be able to get preliminary hardware back in the if we go back 10, 15 years, I used to be almost first on the block with the CPU and the motherboard. Nowadays that is not the case. So the advanced stuff is kind of reserved more for higher end integrators and release partner type of operation. So and that's Pete's works for a larger operation there in the UK that gets this advanced stuff. So I allow him to do a lot of the testing. I still do a lot of the development with the actual test sessions and
Hmm.
procedures. So that's the short story of what I do. And there's also a podcast as well, which I've been running for about 4 years now. So I pull in industry pioneers and software developers, and we basically just cover the whole gamut of music technology and computer technology and all the related stuff. So yeah, that's me.
Well, and that was one of the things that actually made me quite interested in talking to you, especially on the podcast as well, is that, it's very clear you are a veteran. You've been doing professional work, building professional systems for a long time now. And that a lot of that involves speaking to plenty of people at Microsoft and Intel as well, right? I mean,
Hmm.
you're used to discussing the latest releases with professionals actually working at like Intel day to day, right?
Yeah. Look, my contact with Intel directly, not so much. I have some fantastic contacts at Microsoft, which is cool.
Hmm.
My co host, Pete Brown, is integral over there at Microsoft. He's like a middleman between the Microsoft development team and the media professionals like myself, and also mostly audio, but it also crosses over into video, not so much gaming. But Pete's our middleman. He's also the chair of the MIDI 2 Association. So any of the musicians listening in will know what MIDI is, which is Musical Instrument Digital
Hmm.
Interface. This is a protocol for connecting instruments and controller keyboards and a whole stack of stuff.
Well, one thing, because I'm sure you're aware, um, I do a lot of leaks of upcoming products from
Yes.
various companies. That usually, I mean, especially these days, the bigger I get, the more I do this, the more people I have to talk to. It involves really talking to like a dozen people sometimes at like Intel or AMD, because especially with Intel, I think a lot of people, a lot of gamers, like, make up the majority of this audience, like fail to or maybe forget, when you really shouldn't forget, this should be always present in your head when you're thinking about what a company is working on, that Intel's a huge company, and what one person knows may not be the same as another person knows. Even
No.
on the same
Yeah.
product, like Meteor Lake has come up recently. Like, just because one person at Meteor Lake knows what the original design was 4 or 5 years ago, doesn't mean if they're working on the CPU side, they knew what happened to the graphics thing until recently. And
Yeah.
so, like,
Yeah.
and I'm actually starting to find that AMD used to be like 10,000 people. I think they're now almost 25,000 or something. I'm starting to find that a little bit at AMD. That's where some of the confusion came with RDNA 3. Like, it used to be, yeah, one person would probably know most things about a product, but not anymore. There are just too many products. They're too complex. They're too siloed away now. You're getting an AMD that's almost a third the size of Intel. They're not there yet, but you can see it's going to happen. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
going to start turning into, it's hard to know. Maybe it's actually easier to know some of the things they're working on because of how many people are working on a project, but it's hard to know if it will turn out well or not ahead of
Yeah,
time,
yeah. Look, a lot of the larger these companies become, the more compartmentalized the development becomes. So that could be anywhere from audio application development, software development, to the operating systems. I mean, Microsoft is a huge
Oh, yeah.
conglomerate.
People forget
It,
they're enormous.
yeah, and it's completely compartmentalized. You might have 5 or 10 different teams working on specific areas of the kernel, for example, right?
Hmm.
Um, and everyone is designated the owner of that particular portion of the uh, of the of the application code. And if they make some decisions that has caused some issues, it's sometimes it's very difficult to actually get them to acknowledge that they've actually created a problem there. So I've had some indirect and direct communication with the kernel team with some issues that we've actually highlighted, and it's not easy. And like you said, you might need to speak to 4 to 5 different people before you can actually even piece something together.
And let me put it this way. There's been leaks I've done where a story started with a set of information from one or two people, And then by the end of it, I'm actually telling the original sources that got me looking into something what's actually
Yeah.
happening. Like they did it. They're like, well, I think this, that's not possible. I start asking other people. Then one of them is able to provide me with a more recent slide or documentation. And then I'm able to ask someone. And then the theory I come up with after talking to 20 people, I'll go back to all of the sources and go, actually, it kind of seems like this is what's happening. Whether you realize it or not, is that possible? Then that's where the final script for one of my videos will finally be completed, is when some half of the sources realize it's not what it seems.
Yeah.
It really does happen.
Yeah, and that comes down to the compartmentalization, and I think they do that on purpose, so
For sure.
so that you're specifically working on a very focused area of whatever, whether it's a code or a kernel application level, or even one part of a program, and that's your focus. You don't worry about that. Anything else apart from that. The problem that I see with that is that when they have to join when they have to connect all the dots at the end, and then things go squirrely, they're pointing the fingers in every way except for themselves, to themselves. So that's what I've found, and it does frustrate me at times talking to. But even with at the driver level stuff, as soon as if I get put directly in charge with the lead driver developer, and as soon as I see owner on the signature, I'm like, shit, I'm in trouble here, right? Because this guy is not going to acknowledge anything. He's, if he's actually responsible for releasing that driver in that state that it is, he's going to sit there and backpedal and do some as much ass covering as he possibly can, and that's the experience that I have had. And look, it could be even software developer stuff, DAW bugs, and you report them and all in good faith, and if you're landing on a person that's not directly responsible for it, and he has to take accountability for it, they're going to sit there and push back. That's not a bug, that's a feature. Or type of dynamic. And look, I can understand it to a degree, but it's very, very frustrating from my point, because in the end, I'm the first call for my professional clients when there is a problem with the software. Not always, but a lot of times I'm the first call, especially when they've been talking to their support people from the dedicated companies and not getting any answers. And look, there's been instances where someone's been run around for about 1 or 2 weeks before they message me. I'm going, why don't you message me straight away? And I've gone, this is the fix here. And they've gone, well, why don't they know that? I said, because you're landing on some poor guy at a help desk who's got a pre-canned script, and if they don't know the answer, they're going to sweat it, because everything that they say is monitored. And wouldn't it be easy to say, look, you know what, I don't have the answer. Let me get it for you.
Right.
How difficult?
And
I
think a lot of, by the way, journalists in the tech gaming space, reach out to AMD for a comment.
I like it. I like the way you did that. Sorry, I like the way you did journalists with because I'm doing exactly the same thing. Anytime I mention a journalist or a review, I'm usually quoting, in my industry, because there's no such thing as reviews anymore in my industry. But
there's some good reviewers still, but I think some people will reach out to AMD and they'll get a line from an intern or a low-level guy that basically didn't answer their question and draw a conclusion. And it's like, the guy doesn't know the answer and he didn't pass it up the chain. That doesn't speak for the entire company as some big thing.
No.
I don't want to get into that whole thing right now. That'll probably be something I'm hinting at that I get to in a week or something. But anyways, though, you've been dancing around a little bit, though. You design, or, well, you know what I mean, but configure, build, test, and these purpose-built workstations with CPUs, graphics, audio components that aren't just meant to be powerful. They're meant to do stable audio, right?
Well,
which is a very different type of thing that involves latency issues, and just bugs become so the thing you want to isolate out when you're designing one of these workstations. It's quite different than building a normal workstation for just general use. And I mean, What made you reach out to me though? What made you want to come on the show to talk about this though?
Well, I mean, I've look, for many years, I was the Intel leak type of guy as well. You know, I had I don't have the sources that you have, but I always used to monitor all of those leak sites, and I used to know every code name and what was coming. So when
It's
I
fun
stumbled,
though. I mean,
yeah, it
you
is.
know,
So when I stumbled on your site, I just said, oh, here's a kindred spirit. And I've been monitoring the HEDT area for a few years. So, and this is the HEDT area is the predominant platform for my professional clients. And
hmm
that's not to say that you can't build a very solid professional workstation with what I call high-end enthusiasts. So that, let's say, if we just use the Intel terminology, if we're talking Z series, right? Z
hmm
series chipsets and K. So let's CPUs K series and X series, right? And Xeons, that's another probably a whole other chapter. But if we just stick with K and X series, now the X series for professional DAW use have always been the predominant platform for not only the DSP processing, which is the plugins, but also for virtual instruments. Now, there's a type of virtual instrument that is based on sample playback used. That gets enormous use with professional composers doing orchestral composition and that type of stuff.
Yeah, you
Now,
told me this before in our touch base call that,
yeah,
and this isn't really a surprise, but just to lay this out for everybody, you know, when you and their orchestras are used so often in movies and video games now, but they will compose the music and simulate what it would sound like, right, using a program first, say that's what we want it to sound like, and then they pay the thousands and thousands of dollars to hire all of these professional musicians to come into a room and actually record it right. But
yeah,
they
not
use audio
but
workstations first to simulate it, right?
of course, but depending on the budget, that not
Sure.
necessarily they're going to be actually transferring what you've actually created within the DAW
Mhm.
to the real players. Um, the sampling engines and the sample libraries have become so sophisticated. You'd have to be extremely good to be able to pick it. You know, so
Mhm.
and these professional composers have become so proficient in articulating those instruments, whether it's a string part or brass or woodwind, and they've become so proficient at actually articulating um, those the dynamics of those instrument performances. You'd have to be really good, you know. And
Mhm.
so let's just say a large majority of what we're hearing orchestral wise in TV and streaming would have no real orchestra whatsoever.
Mhm.
When it comes to the larger production films, and even like independent films, you'd be surprised they would not have any real players. That would be the actual what they call the orchestral mock-up, but it's not. It actually becomes the final production. Um, in the larger films, yeah, sure, you know they'll get someone to orchestrate it all out, write it out, and then they get the real players. And um, look, you know, it sounds incredible either way, you know,
Mhm.
uh, but you'll be surprised how much of it there is no. It's all virtual instruments that a lot of those orchestral and film
What you're
scores.
making me think of is like behind the scenes of so many games. They will go and, you know, for this battle scene, we actually hired this orchestra, and then they'll show them playing and they'll go, and we thought this was necessary to really get the full feel. I'm just now realizing the reason that was in a behind the scenes or a making of a video game I like is because that was probably the one song they actually hired an orchestra
Yeah, they
for.
probably hired the real orchestra. The rest
And
of it,
that's why they're talking about it. I didn't realize probably because the rest of them they didn't, you know.
yeah, yeah. And look, and so the workstations. Um, that we're talking mission critical. They have to be mission critical. They have to be running at extremely low latencies. Now, when I say low latencies, good um, instrument players, they will start feeling uncomfortable at around about a 4 millisecond round trip latency, or let's say about a 6 millisecond round trip latency. And when I'm saying round trip latency, that's the input and output. So if once you start getting above 3 or 4 milliseconds, or when you're actually playing the instrument and input, and actually when you hit the key and you're hearing something, and then it has to go through the processing, has to go and then out through the D to A as well, so to whatever you're listening to. Once we start getting above that 6 milliseconds, people start getting really, they can get uncomfortable. So to build workstations that can reliably work at those round trip latencies reliably is, a bit of a challenge. I mean, we have to look. It does come down to component choice. You can't go cheaping out on anything. I mean, you can build a cheap machine. For years it was always the Mac versus PC. This is before the AMD versus Intel time. It was always Mac versus PC. And the consensus, in the 90s was that the Macs were super reliable, PCs were just basically garbage. And I'm thinking, well, what are you comparing it to? And they're trying to compare someone that would go to the absolute lowest common denominator to build a PC versus a Mac, where if you actually selected higher level components on your PC, whether it's power supply, motherboard, graphics cards, once you assemble those PCs, they were a lot more expensive than the bargain basement ones, but they were equally as reliable as a Mac. And this is how I've made my living since 1995, is building solutions, PC solutions that were very, very reliable. They would work in these mission critical environments. And that was simply, it comes down to component choice, and there's a whole stack of R&D that we do as well. Like some motherboards, for example, DPC latency, which is, that'll be something that the gamers listening in would be aware of, which is these micro latencies that can interfere with real-time audio playback. With the gamers, they feel it with response times and that type of stuff, And I'll give you a perfect example of DPC latency. Windows 10, I'm trying to remember the version number because it's from the versions in 2018 to 1903 introduced massive DPC latency problems, massive. And we were freaking out in the audio world going, well, we can't use this. What's going on? And of course, through my contacts at Microsoft, we're trying to drill down what the problem was. And no one was really looking into it or putting their hand up and taking any accountability for it until, and this is where the story comes full circle, the gamers started complaining, right? So professional audio, we're barely a dot on the radar, Tom. We're not even a blip. We're gamers. That's a far larger market. And as soon as the gamers started complaining about DPC latency, you know what? There was a little patch released within, I don't know, a couple of weeks, but it took 6 months of screaming, and then it got fixed, and then that was resolved in 1909. But this is the type of stuff that can bring professional DAWs down very, very quickly. And also the stability has to be at the audio interface level as well, which comes down to the quality of the drivers. Now, you mentioning kind of graphics. I mean, graphics, obviously, there's a lot of graphic content on the screen, but it's not 3D, it's 2D. We're dealing with 2D graphics, but there's a lot going on with the graphics engine as well with these DAWs, because it's like at the moment I'm recording and you see it's like creating the waveform in real time, and there's a cursor moving. So there's a fair amount of stuff that is running in the background and having to be maintained within that ultra low latency. So the graphics drivers are still very, very important.
You're kind of dancing around this. Just let me directly ask.
Yeah.
Zabito3 writes and it says, what are things you typically consider when putting together an audio workstation? Are there any unusual decisions you might make when compared to other more standard types of workstations? And that's what I was going to just combine with another just bullet point I had for you too. Like, what's unusual, what's different about making an audio workstation specifically versus another one, and what are the unique challenges? Like if you were making a Threadripper system with, a 4090 for video editing or gaming and editing or rendering or some type of scientific work, like what stuff do generally all of those do that you just don't do? Like what's unique in making this truly from what most other workstations would worry about instead?
Look, with DAWs, graphics is not overly important. I mean, graphics
Right.
GPU performance is not overly important because there's no GPU processing. Well, not at the moment. I mean, there's some stuff that is actually evolving, which we'll probably chat about a little bit later. But generally, the GPUs just need to be solid, and they need to be solid within a 2D environment. So that's where it's different to a video editing machine or a gaming machine where you're dealing with 3D or you're dealing with heavy processing via the CUDA GPU processors, right? So that's not something that we are needing to navigate around with audio.
Hmm.
With the GPU, it just needs to be something that's solid and low DPC latency. It just needs to have a low micro latency. You look at AMD cards are, I think, have a little bit better with the DPC latency and stuff, but the vast majority are still using NVIDIA. We don't need to go to these larger graphics cards. I mean, if anyone goes and checks out the machines on my website, they'll see that all of them are actually, the current ones are running internal GPUs, which is fine. And if they want something to say run 3 or 4 screens, I use small Quadra cards. I don't necessarily go to the big RTX cards. Where I will go to the RTX cards if a client comes to me and I regard these hybrid systems, and they'll say, yes, I'm a professional audio. I need it for professional audio, but I'm also doing video editing, whether it's with Adobe Premiere or DaVinci Resolve, something like that. And so they need a larger GPU, and that's when I start looking at the RTX cards. But we don't traditionally need to go to those larger graphics cards for pure DAW use. So what's important for DAW use is you don't necessarily have to go for these gamer styled
Absolute
motherboards.
monsters. Yeah.
Yeah, with all of the Bluetooth and the Wi-Fi, you just don't. I mean, if you need that, fine, right? But if the thing that draws me to motherboard choices when I'm building workstations is the bare minimum when it comes
Because
to that.
just and some people probably heard you just say the Bluetooth and the Wi-Fi, and they're like, wait, what is this guy talking about? You don't need that. You're saying you want the minimum amount of drivers and components installed because that's just more things that can have a weird bug that messes with latency or
Yeah.
audio.
And all of those devices are actually sharing resources in the back end of the motherboard, right? So, if you want to have clear PCIe lanes, if you want to add additional, whether it's audio PCI interfaces or DSP cards, anything like that, you'd want minimal sharing of those PCIe resources. So, it's the first thing, for example, the first thing I do with any of these machines is I disable any components that we don't need. And the first thing is the onboard audio, just gone, right? Because we're using professional audio interfaces. We don't need the onboard audio. A bit harder on laptops, obviously, but I tend not to, and this is a personal preference of mine, simply because I know what kind of headaches I get with product support. I don't offer Wi-Fi, for example, where other DAW builders do. And I've gone, well, I just won't take that support call because all of a sudden, instead of being an audio specific support call I'm getting, my Wi-Fi is not connecting. Well, mate, I'm not interested in actually dealing with that. That's not something I want to deal with. So good quality boards with minimal junk. Well, it's not junk, but
Minimal different things that are pinging the CPU, basically.
Yeah. And look, there's not all of the major motherboard manufacturers have good product. I'm not going to specifically say one is overly better than the other, right? Especially at that K level. Pick which one, a brand that you're familiar with. I have very specific brands that I deal with, and that's actually changed over the years. And that will come down to things like, what kind of motherboard failures have I had over a series run, for example?
Hmm.
I've had series runs where motherboard failures have been absolutely zero, and I'm talking hundreds of systems zero. And then I've had another series from a particular manufacturer that almost bankrupted me because there was a 90% failure rate on the board.
This piece of content is brought to you by geeknuck.com and the Serpent Canyon NUC 12. This NUC starts at just $1,000 and comes with a 16 gigabyte A770M and 14 core i7. But you can, of course, order it pre-configured with Windows, 64 gigabytes of RAM, and a 2 terabyte Gen 4 NVMe SSD for just an extra $300. They're not overcharging on the pre-configuration options here, and which either option you choose, it's far cheaper than what you will find on Amazon or at Walmart. And on that note, GeekNuck wants me to emphasize that the prices they have from their own website are always cheaper than going to some outside website, and they also offer a direct 3-year warranty since they are an Intel Titanium partner. Cut out the middleman and save by buying direct from geeknuck.com today. And when you do, make sure you use the code below and on screen to get another $50 off your order. Just clicking on the link in the description below helps Moore's Law is Dead directly, and using that code helps the channel even more if you need this product, in addition to saving you some money. Support Moore's Law is Dead and get a cool high-powered NUC for the lowest price possible at geeknuck.com today. I've got a similar thing with power supplies because I did a lot of like mining like a few years ago, and not just for mining, but just works like different PCs I'd build as well. And I know there's some brands of power supplies people swear by. They say they're good. You can say I'm crazy. You can say it was all anecdotal evidence, and to a certain degree, you're right. But I know which power supply companies I had to replace 10 times, and I know which ones I never had to touch and actually worked well above the specs they listed.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's a similar thing for you where you're like, look, no one else is complaining about this issue, but it happened to me 5 times in a row. I'm going to assume it wasn't a coincidence.
100%. Power supplies is one of those key components that I was mentioning before. You cannot cut corners on power supplies. Now, the other area for me that's very, very important is that the machines have to be quiet. And when I say quiet, they have to be really quiet, whisper quiet. Now, I'm in a room with 3 of my systems at the moment, and I can guarantee you're not going to hear any of them. So, and they have to remain quiet, even at working at that 100%. It's easy to make a machine that's quiet at idle, but you've got to be quiet at 100% CPU load. A lot of my clients work within the same room, so they're home studio environments and compositional environments. The machines are in there with them. They don't have machine rooms. Some people do. But so that was always one of my key aspects of my machines is not only were they very stable, they were also very, very quiet. And that was very important for the clients, something that I've always maintained. And I'm glad you brought up power supplies because I've had periods where I've had an amazing run with power supplies. And you can fill in a couple of blanks with the different brands. I have a particular favorite brand at the moment, but the supply of it is almost non-existent. So I'm kind of shuffling around. And I don't go by brand. I go by who the OEM manufacturer is of these units. So I kind of dig a little bit deeper. And if I have to find an alternative power supply, I will find, if I can, another brand of power supply that uses the same OEM, for example. So yes, I agree. Power supplies. We're going around in circles a bit here, but we're agreeing, Tom. Very, very important. So there isn't an enormous difference between the way I would approach an audio workstation, and because I used to build video editing machines as well, where the main difference between those two in the past would have been the storage, the throughput for the storage. So we used to RAID drives and even RAID some of the smaller SATA. But once we got into M2, there was really no point.
It's so fast. Yeah.
So the only significant difference between my video editing machines that I only do just for some clients, some existing clients still, and the audio production systems is the big RTX, cards. That's a significant difference.
And then also just minimizing the amount of components and drivers you install, just because audio already sucks to work with in terms of stability. Let's just remove as many things as possible from ever causing something to go wrong.
It's just look, there are some motherboards that on the surface look great, but because of the selection of components that are on there, the DPC latency is just horrible.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there isn't. People, I've been accused of being a snake oil salesman, over the years, because anyone can actually put a DAW together, and I'd always say to these people, if I could be bothered actually responding, would be the systems are more than the sum of the parts, because there's 25 years plus of knowledge that I've put into these machines, and I support.
And you've tested all these components. You've made sure this exact thing works together well.
And I support my clients. So I said that is where the benefit of the professional DAW builders is that is the combined IP and the knowledge that we bring to the systems. Yes, you can go all out and copy every single component, but I can guarantee you the machine may not work as well. I've got a stack of background Windows optimizations that I don't even share with my mate Pete Brown from Microsoft because he wouldn't be overly happy. But there's a whole stack of background Windows optimizations that those of us that have been building DAWs for the decades, that we've got a little grab bag of optimizations that we know that are more placebos, and we know the ones that actually can benefit greatly. We found a recent one with Windows 11 where we had to kind of dig up, I don't mind sharing this, we had to dig up core parking applications. I haven't had to tweak anything in regards to core parking since about 2008, 2009. And now we've discovered with Windows 11 on both AMD and the Intel machines, the power profiles on Windows 11 have been changed to a point where even under the performance modes, or even if you run ultimate performance modes, cores remain parked unless you actually physically run the app to unpark them. Now, this is something that I haven't had to do, like I said, since about 2008, 2009. So these are the type of little areas that, and there's way more of them, but I'm not going to share anymore. So that one's a freebie. But that's one that actually threw me for about 12 months, because I was doing a whole stack of 12th gen development, and I'm thinking, why are there's some very uneven threading and load balancing going on, and it wasn't overly obvious until I discovered that core parking tweak. And even with that core parking, there's massive DPC latency, micro latencies being reported in our DPC latency checker that we discovered was to do with the core parking. And again, it wasn't overly obvious, and it took us a long time to figure it out, because one of my colleagues would just automatically do the core parking tweak whether it needed or not. That was just in his little tweak bag. And I wasn't, and I was getting these ridiculous high micro latencies, and he wasn't. And we're trying to piece together what was going on. I'm sending information to motherboard manufacturers, to Microsoft. Everyone's pointing a finger at each other, and it just ended up being, from my understanding, the thread directors, Intel thread director. No, the AMDs are doing it as well.
It's a bit different. Intel literally has a thread director, right, for their big little products, and then AMD has their own CPU threads, selector for highest boost speed. It's kind of a similar thing. It's just Intel's is way more elaborate.
But it wasn't thread director. Sorry, I apologize. It would have to be if it was happening on the AMD. So it's something removed from the thread director. But I ended up being core parking. And these are kind of like small things that you don't pick up until you just do a whole stack of empirical testing watching the way that the thread management is actually working. Look, a lot of, how many end users are going to sit there and watch a task manager, to see how threads are being applied? They don't,
Well, and that's an important thing you're kind of getting towards too, is to just like wrap up what your point is here. What I would say is maybe some of the things you're doing to me could come off as snake oil because I'm an enthusiast who tinkers with my systems constantly, and I know what to look for maybe. But a lot of these people are composing music, they're musicians, and you've perfected a set of things you can do, which components work together well. These people aren't ultra overclocking gamers who are willing to spend all their time dealing with this. And some people can call it snake oil, but all these people who would call it snake oil, probably it's their hobby to mess with this stuff. Most people, it isn't,
Yeah. And look, and my professional clients are not interested in the politics or the back end mechanics as much. They just want to fire up the machines and work with them in a mission critical environment. That's their sole focus. So they much prefer, having someone to have done that. And I've got a tagline on my website that says, how much is your time worth? And that came about because, clients that always press me for pricing on the machines, it's too expensive. And I'm just thinking, well, how much is your time worth would be a question that I'd ask them. I go, well, what do you mean? Well, if you own a studio, what's your hourly rate? And they'll go, whatever, X amount, $30, $40. I said, okay, multiply that by how many hours you've spent and wasted trying to stabilize your machine, and then come up with that figure in your head, and then come back and tell me that my machines are too expensive. Because
that's something I've come to terms with too, making content on YouTube, is there was what it was worth to me when I was a gamer who overclocked for fun in a college dorm. My time was worth very little back then. And then there's now where it's like each one of these podcast episodes, I've put days worth of work into preparing. Gerard's going to spend a day editing and double checking facts and doing things with, and then I'm going to spend more time after that with some other contributors making sure it's perfect. This is a week's worth of work when you combine all the people who are working on it. Like if something goes wrong in my PC compared to in college where I'd spend 2 days trying to see if I can fix it, I'll just go, what will fix it? Order it now. It's a business expense. Let's get this done. Because this is just not, it's such a, and for like a studio, their time's worth even more than mine, I'm sure, because of how many people are a part of that.
Yeah. So that's a really strong point for me. How much is your time worth? Look, I've got some amazing clients that have been with me for over 15 years. They're probably up to their fourth or fifth machine by now. But it is thinning. It's a very tough market. And, especially with the longevity of the deployments of these machines. I like in the early days, especially when those core counts were evolving at a more accelerated rate, we would get, I'd get clients needing new machines every 3 years, 2-3 years, for example. Then it was like 5 years. Now I've had clients coming back to me 10, 12 years. They've used their machines and they've popped their heads up and saying, well, how much more powerful is this machine? I've gone, I can't even graph it. So, and these current, when I say current, the last 3 to 5 years, I mean, if we're talking, 16 to 18 core systems, it'd be hard pressed for these. There's only a very small percentage of people that are going to be actually tapping those machines out. So my repeat client cycle is actually just extending. So it's getting tougher, but it's okay. It's an area that I've been navigating since 1995. So it's just it's a challenge that it's always a challenge for me to kind of stay ahead of everything, and it's something that I enjoy. But it'd be nice if I could just tap into a wider market. and Apple's it's kind of had a bit of a resurgence as well, so that makes it tougher as well. So there'd be, if people are weighing up whether to go Mac or PC, I would say that they're having a bit more of a resurgence back to Mac, I would say, and there's a couple of
Well,
factors
they're
there.
making their own hardware. One of my Gerard, my audio engineer, has both his workstation with like a 4090 and like really powerful stuff. He does not just work for me, but he's actually in a band, does the editing and preparing for his band. So this really makes sense for
Right.
him to have a
Yep.
powerful system. But then he also has a very high-end MacBook that uses Apple Silicon because he says, the stability just can't beat it. And there's been times where weird bugs happen and he has no clue. He's pulling out his hair. Why won't this render correctly? Why won't this? He goes on Mac and takes an hour to redo it, and it just always done
And
works.
this is the same This is the same video editing application, or the
Well,
same
no,
audio.
that's the thing. He'll just decide to switch applications because he just
Yeah.
doesn't know
Yeah.
what the bug is.
Yeah.
Not worth it,
Yeah. 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 Look, there's a lot of strength in Apple, but they've been my nemesis for the last 20, close to 30 years. So I always tread very, very carefully when it comes to comparative performance with the Apple stuff, and I tend to be the guy that a lot of Apple people dislike, because I'll do some comparative performance stuff. It actually flies in the face of what I call the Apple RDF, the reality distortion field level of reporting. And
I feel like both sides have a distortion field, though, because you talked about how some people will compare this budget PC to an Apple one and say, well, but this is really better. And it's like, well, yeah, but you've gone so cheap that it actually isn't comparable anymore. You
no,
just don't seem to realize how much worse this is than that Apple system. But then you have some Apple people who just think the Apple thing's 4 times better than it really is as well.
yeah,
I really both sides think their thing's 4 times better than it really is. Like you need
yeah,
to use high end components on PC usually to actually match the high end components in the Apple machine. And then once you do that, like there's still usually pros and cons to either side.
yeah, yeah. Well, I think there's a part of the reality distortion field, I think, is actually descended over Intel over over recent times.
Absolutely, yeah.
So so do you want to move on?
Well, that's what I was going to bring up right now, though. So, speaking of testing things and, all of the things we've talked about, one of the main reasons you reached out to me was about Intel's current situation with Workstation, Server, HEDT, and their Sapphire Rapids
mm,
processors. Like QH Freddy writes in and asks, what were your first thoughts when you got your hands on Sapphire Rapids, and how have things changed since then? So I'm just going to use
okay.
this to kind of launch into the conversation about you have quite a saga here and
Yes.
quite a lot of opinions about Sapphire Rapids.
Yes. Well, I mean, look, this was something that was very, very important to me because I I wrote an article on my Facebook Doorbench Facebook page where I broke it up in 3 or 4 parts, and the last part was basically just tracking the Intel HEDT history.
Hmm.
And so starting on X58, X79, X99, X299. So there was a pretty reliable 3-year cadence between X58 to X79, X79 to X99, X99 to X299, right? So it was 2008, 2011, 2014, 2017. So X299 is 2017. So that's enough to freak anyone out because we're in 2023 now, and they've only just announced that they're actually stopping production of them.
Hmm.
You can't find any. There's no motherboards gone. But X299, I was still building X299 machines till the end of last year. So that's a 5-year run. So that's pretty much 2 years. They were overdue for a HEDT replacement. The
You're saying for
1090.
the exact workloads you run,
Yep.
those old 14 nanometer 10980XC type
Mm,
things,
mm.
those are the ones that were just always giving you the consistent report performance. And it hasn't been, and well, they didn't make any new HEDT. And I believe you said Threadripper always had some latency issues. And so really it wasn't until Zen 4 and Alder Lake that they started finally offering you something new to use for your customers.
Yeah. Well, look, the interesting thing, and I'll bring AMD into the conversation now, is that uh, there was they were in the wilderness there was probably a period there, seriously, Tom, for about 10 years where they weren't
Hmm.
even part of the conversation. They weren't even part of the conversation. Then when the Zen came out, that's when everyone's ears pricked up and went, hey, these guys are back. But it took them a couple of generations to actually catch up. So, Zen 1, for example, if you're going core to core, and I think they were up to 8 cores. There's no way in the world that they were matching the Intel 8 cores at the time.
For your workloads.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, and when I'm saying that, it's specifically for
I know.
audio production stuff, right?
But I think this is worth emphasizing, because if someone skips into this part of the podcast, they may hear this, and it's really not a surprise to me, because it really wasn't until Zen 3 that AMD was finally getting to like a consistent latency performance in basically all applications that came close to a lot of the things Intel was doing. But
Yep.
for a lot of people, they wouldn't have known that, and I just say it every now and then to make sure.
Yeah. So Zen 1, that was quite a remarkable shift, and I was even though I was building predominantly Intel machines then. Actually, I was building primarily and only Intel machines.
Basically,
then.
yeah.
And so I was watching it very, very closely, and Zen 1 just, didn't do a thing. Didn't do a thing for me. The AMD fraternity, I affectionately call them the AMD lobby, right? So there's a group of diehard AMD guys, and good on them, right? And they just go, man, Zen's back. It's going to kick Intel's ass. Well, Zen
2 was when things got bad for them in a lot of departments.
Yeah.
Maybe not yours, but a lot.
No. Well, I'll tell you, Zen 2, 30, so let's say 30, we'll go to the top chip, right? So 3950, that would have been up against, I'm looking at 2019, and so the 10th gen had 10 cores, and we're talking 16 cores at what I call the enthusiast level. We weren't talking HEDT, right? So Intel still had, they had the...
You're talking the AMD 3950X versus the Intel 10900K.
10900K, right? So we're talking at that level. Now, you got to remember, Intel still had their X series, so they could go up to 10, 12, up to 18, and that was going up against the Threadripper.
The AMD up to 64 cores, yeah.
Yes, right. And so for audio stuff, the Threadrippers really didn't make a dent, because the DAW software wasn't actually playing ball with it. So when it got to Ryzen 3 3950, that was the 4x4 CCX, and they still were not outperforming the 10th gen. Right, they still weren't.
Yeah, and with Zen 3, the 5000 series, when AMD finally unified 8 cores per CCD / CCX, same thing now.
Yes, yeah. and with the Ryzen 5000 5950, that's when it really started competing very well against not only the Z series but also up against the 10X series. Right, it still didn't catch it with the virtual instrument stuff until the 7950, and that's the DDR5. And it comes down to the memory throughput. Now, Threadripper should have been something that we could have been all over these high-end DAWs. The only problem is that they just did not thread efficiently above a particular logical core count, which happens to be 32. For DAW usage, the sweet spot is 16 core or 32 thread, and this is where the 13900K is still very, very powerful, in that even though it's only got 8 performance cores, those 16, what they call, we'll call them, E cores, economy cores, in combination, that is actually going head to head with the 7950, which kind of surprised me, right? So we were expecting the Sapphire Rapids to actually bring a whole new level of performance to the Intel platform. And those early videos, those leaked videos that I was watching of yours, where you were, as soon as it was confirmed that the W2400 and 3400 was going to be on the same chipset.
Right, which, just to back up here, I've been doing, well, really, because it took so many delays and so long to come out, I've been doing Sapphire Rapids leaks, I think, since 2020, so it took forever. Right. I could not believe it's, by the way, very funny for me. Every now and then I'll be looking at old stuff and being like, what did I say a couple of years ago? Is this something related to this? And I'll go, oh my God, I leaked these specs like years before it came out. It just took them this long to get it ready. The original leaks for Sapphire Rapids, I remember, yeah, my Fishhawk Falls leak. That was a big one. I believe this channel was the first one to break the story that they had a 24 core monolithic version of
Monolithic. Yeah.
Sapphire.
Yeah.
Right, which I'm sure perks your ears up. And at the time, they did have a smaller socket planned for that. They did. And then, or at least a different one with that was tailored. And now it's just one socket. And then you just put this tiny die on this huge Sapphire
Yeah.
Rapids package.
Yeah.
And
Frog in
that
a pond.
surprised me.
Yeah. Frog in a pond.
I think I was told that, by the way, like months before, or like right before they officially announced it, and I was like, I couldn't believe, like, oh, really? And it seemed like an almost last minute decision to use one platform for both the monolithic dies and the multi-tile dies.
It doesn't feel very structured at all. It does feel like a last minute thing. And this is, I've voiced this numerous times on my blog and also some forum threads that I actually frequent, that as soon as it was confirmed that the two were going to be merged, I had a sinking feeling that there was going to be a problem, because we're talking completely different architectures here, Tom. As you know, we're talking about a monolithic die, the little frog in a pond sitting in a package that is designed size to accommodate a 4-chiplet modular design, and all of a sudden they go, oh, why don't we just keep using that socket and we'll just drop the chip right in the middle? I mean, it's just no. And
well, on that dash, my hopes that this would be a reasonably priced platform for like gamer creators as well, because I looked online and me and you talked about this offline, like there aren't really a lot of reviews for Sapphire Rapids workstations.
Hardly any.
But I don't think anyone's buying them, and that's why, because if you look online, the motherboards are like $1,000. Like, this is not a replacement of X399. It isn't.
No,
it's just way too X299. It's way too expensive. Like, this is just not even the same thing.
Yeah. So this is the these are the points that I was making. So when all of those leaks that you had released came to fruition in February 15, all the NDAs got lifted. I was expecting a flood of reviews and benchmark, and I'm thinking, well, where are these things? And I wasn't getting anything from my channel about availability or pricing, which that was kind of the odd one with the pricing. But then we discovered that that press release thing that I actually sent you as well, that had some kind of rudimentary pricing in there as well. It worked out far more expensive here in Australia, but there was some pricing, and I knew then, forget it, this is not an X299. My biggest problem was always going to be the combined chipset, because the Xeon, the higher level Xeon, they always had a separate chipset to the X series. The X series always gave us far more management in regards to clocking. There was always a healthy all-core turbo and top turbo clock. The Xeons were always more reserved. So seeing a combined chipset, I had my concerns, which came to fruition, which we'll get to. But it was something that when they weren't announcing the pricing, when they weren't announcing when the stock was actually landing. So I'll give you a tip. It hasn't landed here in Australia still. We're in July, right? The motherboard's landed. So it was about a good 6 weeks before they released the pricing, and that gave me a heart attack, because we're talking, the motherboards came in at, we're talking Asus. Let's talk Asus, because that was one of the primary release partners. So there's two Asus boards. One's called a Ace and one's called a Sage. Now the Ace is specifically targeted W2400. It's a quad channel memory board, and the Sage is an 8-channel memory board. So obviously that's targeted at the W3400, you would think, right? Somehow the geniuses have decided that the W2400 is also going to accept the W3400. Now, how does that work? It's an 8-channel chip. And there are people going to say, oh, yeah, well, so what? You can use a 4-channel. There's plenty of memory throughput. But it's not designed specifically for that chip. So it should have remained W2400 only, right? And luckily, Pete, over at Scan in UK. He got some early components, and the pricing. So we're talking $1,800. This is Australian pricing. $1,850 for the Ace board.
Right, so that'd be like $1,200-1,300 in the US, and if it was converted.
$1,850 here, and the Sage is $2,800, which is kind of ludicrous. I've never seen a motherboard at $2,800. So straight away, I'm thinking these guys are taking the piss, because this is not an X299 replacement. They're targeting directly at even over and above Threadripper Pro type of workstation type of areas. And I'm thinking, well, that's $3,400. Why is the $2,400 being targeted at that type of price point? When we started testing these W2400 series, because we're not interested in W3400, that's when the fun started, because immediately one of the things that Pete discovered was that the all-core turbo on these machines, and with our bias tweaks as well, which is applied to the Z series, that will give us a very healthy all-core turbo of whatever, say the 13900K is over 5 gigahertz for the performance cores, right? This is all-core turbo, not top turbo, just all-core turbo. And one of the things that we noticed in the early documents for the W series that we received, the dealer documents and the training documents and stuff, was that they never listed the all-core turbo. They listed the base clock, they listed the top turbo, and they listed the turbo 3. They never listed the all-core turbo. I mean, we never thought too much about it. What we discovered, though, was that these things would not all-core turbo anywhere near where we were expecting. So if we were talking mid 4.6 gigahertz for the turbo bins, we were expecting at least in the 4 gigahertz for the all-core turbos, because it's only usually a couple of hundred megahertz behind what the top turbo bin is. These things were lucky to add a couple of hundred megahertz to the base clock. All right, so we were dealing with mid threes at best to 3 gigahertz on the 24 core. I mean, 3 gigahertz. And we go, what the hell's going on there?
3 gigahertz on a 24 core. How in the heck? I mean, you might as well use a Zen 4 that's just going to run 16 chords at 5.5 gigahertz. It's not even a comparison, actually.
No. So for the first couple of test runs, and I'm doing this by proxy because Pete's got his hands on the stuff, and he's feeding all this information to me. I said, look, there's something wrong there. Can you get a hold of both Intel and ASUS? And I was doing it at my end as well, and saying there's something going on with the all-core turbo with this. That can't be correct. Now, the thing is, Pete was he was just getting stonewalled, and everyone's crossing their arms, and both Intel and ASUS are crossing their arms. The engineers going, no, that's it. Well, why didn't you document it? We didn't need to. Yeah, you did, because if that's the correct all-core turbo, these things are going to be failing out of the gate. Could you imagine? Could you imagine if you can insert name here, any of the mainstream tech review sites got a hold of these things, and the best all-core turbo they could get was a couple hundred megahertz a couple hundred megahertz of let's say max 500 megahertz above base clock, right, and easily a gigahertz below where they should have been. So they would have been getting slaughtered. And this is probably why we still haven't seen any reviews, Tom, right? We still haven't seen any. And the only person that's done any extensive testing and actually released these reports is Pete from Scan, right? Because the NDA was lifted, and Puget Systems have done one, which is basically just a fluff piece. I wouldn't even get anyone to bother reading. I mean, you can go over and have a bit of a read, but they put in a token, a 13900K in the comparative charts. They never even mention in the detail, but the 13900K is actually demolishing the W2400s and 3400s comparatively. And I'm thinking, well, is that an elephant in the room or what? Right? So after the first series of tests, I said to Pete, I don't think you should release this. I seriously don't think you should release these reports, even though everyone's waiting and we've already kind of blabbed that you've got a hold of one of these things and everyone's waiting for the test reports. I've said, seriously, we need to get an answer from both Intel and Asus what is going on with these all-core turbo
Mhm.
bins.
Because this has happened before. I won't name names 'cause there's no point. I almost got caught up in it a little bit. I was actually able to last minute fix the video, but there's been releases where you get bad performance, and then, you know, if it's Intel or AMD, doesn't matter. It's like they should have had this working before they sent this to us for testing.
Oh,
But you put
100%.
out this thing, it doesn't work, and then day of they fixed it and you didn't notice this weird way to fix it, and then everyone calls you stupid,
Yeah.
right? So I see what you're getting at. Like, don't release this unless we're just quadruple sure
Yeah,
this is what we're getting.
quadruple short. So one of the issues was the clocking problem, and the other one that I actually shared with you that I haven't actually shared in any of the written stuff, but I don't mind talking about it today.
For the first half of this year, have you felt like a dog chasing its tail as you scour CD websites and eBay to find any place you can get reasonably priced Microsoft products? Well, you don't need to do that anymore. Just go to cdkeyoffer.com, the best place to get Microsoft operating systems, Office products, select games, and even some gaming hardware peripherals for reasonable prices. And you know, they're always doing special promotions. Right now, in fact, they are doing their mid-year sales event that you're not going to want to miss. So whether you're looking for Steam, EA, Uplay, or PlayStation keys, or of course, Microsoft products or gaming peripherals, support Moore's Law is Dead by using the offer code Broken Silicon for 25% off all Microsoft products and Die Shrink for 3% off everything else on the website. Support Moore's Law is Dead by supporting one of our best long-term sponsors, cdkeyoffer.com today.
Is that there was some really distinct, we'll call them distinct, power requirements for these chips. And we're not talking that they're pulling a lot of power. What's actually happening is that, I'll give you two examples. If you've got we're talking 12 core, you know, the 12 core, the 16 core. We didn't have a 12 core. So we're talking the 16 core. So that's the 2465X, all right? So we're talking the 16 core on the Ace motherboard. It's starting to run up on my door bench testing, which is just you start progressively loading these small plugins incrementally. And it had a what did he have in there originally? I think he had an 850 watt power supply.
I think you said you may have started with 750 watt offline. Is
No,
what I
850.
you telling me, but it could have been 850.
Yeah, it was 850. Started with 850, and the machine came up, but as soon as you press play, it actually shut itself down. And we're not talking restarted; it shut itself down completely. So then he moved to 1,000 watt, and with the 1,000 watt, I think he got like to a 30 or 40% load, and then it shut itself down. And he just kept going up, right? And I think the next one was 1,200 watt. We still didn't get to 100% CPU load. It had to go to a 1,600 watt to keep this machine up. Now, he was testing the 16, 20, and 24 core with that 1,600 watt power supply, and the machine was stable, but the clocking was still up the shit. But at least it was staying up. It wasn't actually shutting itself down. But I said to him, can you actually find some way of measuring the power draw on this to see what kind of power these chips are actually pulling? Because I've seen reports of even running flat out, the 24 core was pulling only 400 watt or so, the chip itself, or under 400 watts. So I'm thinking, why do we need these kind of requirements for the power supply? So we measured the 16 core, we measured the 24 core. Now, the 24 core, so that's the worst case scenario, maximum power draw with the CPUs running not at the standard clock, because we actually managed to fix the all-core turbo, which I'll kind of fixed it. But these machines was running at 4.4 all-core turbo, and it was pulling 500 watts from the wall.
Jeez.
But it was requiring the 1,200 watt would drop. So what we worked out was that it was requiring at least 750 watt overhead above what was actually getting what the machine was demanding. So how, why, what's going on there, right? And then there's this cryptic thing in the manual where it says minimum required 1500 watt power supply or dual
Right.
750. Well,
So anyone who would call you crazy, in the manual it says you need a 1500 watt
1500 watt
power.
power supply. That was a little cryptic one line that we completely missed. And we're thinking, why would you need a 1500 watt power supply? Well, but even better, dual 750. And you're asking yourself, well, how the hell are you going to connect dual 750? Because these motherboards have dual power
Mhm.
rails, dual 24.
I'm used to seeing that for mining rigs. So, yeah.
Well, what do we need for a 24 core?
No, but I agree. That's bizarre that this would need that
Right.
compared to like a 3000 watt mining rig. Why would this need that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and the thing that we'd figured out, and again, this is not confirmed, but this is the only logical thing for me, was that it seems to me that it's actually tripping between those two power rails. So if you don't have a 750 watt overhead above what your machine is pulling, it'll actually trip that first power rail. So maybe it actually requires that dual 750. I don't know. I reckon it's the worst design I've ever seen. It's actually it has to be a design issue there.
Well, let me give you an example too. I did, pretty extensive testing with various Ampere and RDNA 2 graphics cards on my test system over here. And for a while, I just had this like old 1050 watt power supply. I'm like, surely that's enough for any single graphics card, but it was an old one. It came from a mining system that was used for 2 years straight. So it's seen use. So it wouldn't surprise me if it had issues. And the funny thing is in like a 2-month span, I think last year I tested like an RX 6750 XT, like I'm trying to remember what else, but like several high-end AMD graphics cards that were like 6900 and stuff. And these are graphics cards that are supposed to use between 250 to 300 watts. And I found that the 3090 I tested, no issues using those AMD cards that supposedly use 300 watts. The Ampere graphics card, yes, it's listed as a 350 watt card, which is more than the others, but I power limited it. And it wasn't until I limited it to like 180 watts that it wasn't tripping this power supply that I had never had issues with. And it's because Ampere just has these amperage spikes that are like 50% above the power usage, it says. Now, with you, though, I've never seen a product use triple what it's supposed to use. I mean,
this is completely flabbergasted us. So,
but it requires 1500 watts, so that should tell you they know there's something there with probably the rails and power spiking with these products. Otherwise, they would not say it needs 1500 watts. They would. That's there for a reason.
It's bizarre. Well, the only other people that are the only other motherboards that I've seen that have actually gone live with these, there's the ASRock one, but that's got a single power rail. All right, and that's one of those hybrid boards. I think it's actually an 8-channel. That's a full 8-channel W3400 board. I think I have to double check that one. And then Supermicro have got a couple of boards, but they've got very specific boards. You've got the quad channel and the 8-channel boards, and the quad, and they've actually they've got configured systems as well, which has been helpful to see what Supermicro have actually qualified is required. Now, the W2400 series machines, 1200 watt power supply, Tom, 1200 watt, right? They didn't require 1500 watt, right? So worst case scenario, and these guys are running larger Quadra cards or RTX cards in these workstations. So 1200 watt. The W3400, that was an interesting one, 2000 watt. Right.
Oh my God. Almost got to be in Europe to be able to do that.
Yeah. So, but I mean, that one kind of sprung my eyes up. 1200 watt I can accept, right? But we're still dealing with, a power draw that's 700 watt above what is actually getting pulled, right? So there is something going on. Is it a spiking thing? We can't get any answer, right? And just to backtrack a bit, we did manage to get the all-core turbo resolved, right? Kind of and unofficially. right? And people are going, what the hell is he talking about? Well, and I did discuss this in the pre-chat. There was an overclocker that got sent some advanced parts, 24 core and one of these ACE boards. Now, what was his name, Tom? You kind of derailer, not
DeBauer.
DeBauer, that's the one. And I was it was brought to our attention after Pete released that first report that someone was saying, why are you guys kind of struggling, between that 3 to 3.5 gigahertz? This guy's got this thing easily running at 4.4 with a preset, an overclocking preset, and then he moved it up to almost 6 gigahertz. So I thought, what preset? And so I read the article top to bottom, and with the ACE board hidden under a submenu, you're going to love this, hidden under the submenu was a clocking profile that just said water-cooled overclocking profile. Right, that's all it said. It was undocumented in any of the ASUS documents. ASUS didn't even admit that the thing was on that board. No, it was completely undocumented, right? And Pete missed it in the mix the first time. And I've just said, hey, go read this article. You want to just pull that up. Don't change anything else, all right? Don't go mucking around with base clock multipliers or anything like that. Just pull up this this overclocking profile and tell me what it does. Because the guy was saying that it didn't touch the base multiplier. All it did was unlock the all-core turbo. And sure enough, that's exactly what it did, right? So he just didn't do any other tweaking. He called up this so-called water cooling overclocking profile. Now, the CPUs running flat out are barely breaking 55 degrees, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't need water cooling. All right. So at 4.4 gigahertz, well, actually at the standard all-core turbo, they were barely breaking 50. And this was with a single tower Noctua heat pipe cooler. It wasn't even water cooled. When we got the chips to work at that 4.4 gigahertz all-core turbo, the 24 core, the temperatures, I think they didn't break 60, right? And then we reran all the tests at that, Pete was calling it overclocked. I'm calling it unlocked because I don't think it's an overclock because the base multiplier hasn't been touched. It's actually all working within the turbo algorithms, right? This is exactly what we were expecting. All-core turbo above 4 gigahertz. And that completely changed the whole dynamic of how these chips were performing up against the 13900K and the 7950. Because prior to that, the 13900K and the 7950 were actually handing their ass to them in audio production stuff. Now, even at those type of rates, at the higher clock rates, though, it took the 16 core to actually get some single point percentage improvement over those 13900K and 7950K, which is pretty amazing. I mean, we are talking lower clock, right? But that's still pretty impressive. And so these Xeons have still got a mile to go, even at that unlocked all-core turbo at that 4.4. And so we're trying to weigh up, okay, how do we promote and market these chips? Because Puget Systems, there's no way they are actually, whether they even knew about that setting, they're not, all of their test results are not based on that 4.4 gigahertz all-core turbo, right? They're just basing it on whatever their standard one was, which was in the low threes, right? How do we market them? Because there's no way I'm going to be marketing an overclock system. So we've been pushing Intel and ASUS as much as we possibly can to say, listen, this is the true all-core turbo. Can we actually get some type of acknowledgement and an amendment to the clocking profiles for these W2500s? So we're not dealing with these ridiculously low all-core turbo clocks. Nothing's been brought forward. Nothing's been acknowledged. And the chips are almost non-existent out in the marketplace. And then I saw that article where apparently there was some errata on the smaller core systems, right? And they pulled production of all of them. I'm going, what? So they've got an errata on the monolithic die.
You're talking about the recent security issues with Sapphire Rapids where they halted shipping, right?
Is that a security? Was it a security issue? I don't know what it was. They didn't really acknowledge what it was.
Well, they said bug forces Intel to halt Xeon
correct
Sapphire Rapids.
So
right.
there was some,
I don't want to misspeak.
Yeah, there was some errata, and they didn't claim what it was. They just said that for most people the performance wasn't actually being affected. And then this morning, before I joined you, I just spotted an article where they've said, hey, they've fixed it and they're releasing it, and it's probably got a different step. I don't know what's going to happen with all of the product that's out there in the space, but I mean, there is still no product here in Australia. I don't know how much is in Europe or America. Do you know anyone that's actually knocking these things up?
So, yeah, and this is where I want to kind of start steering the conversation, because it's just so fascinating how, like, Intel is so far behind in Workstation and HEDT for most use cases when Threadripper came around. Maybe not for yours, but for most use cases.
Yep.
And then nothing. They basically gave up because they're like, we can't compete with Threadripper.
Mm-hmm.
And then Sapphire Rapids, Fishhawk Falls, I leaked that. It becomes this thing where it's like, well, now AMD has gotten cocky. They're not making new Threadrippers. You know, it's took them forever to get Zen 3, and it was only pro workstations out.
Yep.
And this Zen 4, from what I hear, might not launch on Threadripper until early next year, maybe still only to pro. And they're just really dragging their feet. AMD is not feeling a fire under their ass at all to compete in Workstation.
No.
And when I leaked Fishhawk Falls, it seemed, well, here we go. Maybe if AMD is being lazy, Intel's going to have something interesting. And I think I'm slowly coming to the realization, and why I wanted to have you on, because you seem to be coming to this realization as well, is it just doesn't seem to be there. I mean, Sapphire Rapids exists. My understanding is, especially in the US, if you are one of their main big customers, if you're someone like an HP or a Lenovo or whatever, like a major server customer, you can get Sapphire Rapids server chips like this, and they will have like 1 month lead times or something. Like, they will just get it to you because they know how behind they are in server. They want to make sure they tend to those customers. But for everyone else, and I do talk to retailers and just kind of more mom and pop stores that, you know, are maybe, I've been told some of them do like the business of like 2 micro centers a month. And they do mostly to do it yourself, but then they also do small server contracts with like local businesses. They'll build them servers themselves, and they can't get a hold of Sapphire Rapids. The only people that can get a hold of Sapphire Rapids right now are like the biggest customers. And I don't see any gaming websites talking about how great these workstations are. I don't see anyone testing them. And in fact, while you were talking there, I was Googling around. There's articles that have been out since March where they were like, if you push the all-core turbo past 5 gigahertz, this thing requires at least 1900 watts. So you're not the only one who's noticed that these 400-watt CPUs actually can require much more. And I even I Googled around for boutique PC builder websites. I'm like, surely someone must offer these Xeons for boutique gamers or whatever who have more money than sense. I found one. The second I put one of these Sapphire Rapids CPUs in the configuration menu, it said at least 1200 watts required. Like, it just switched the power supply on me. So you're not I'm starting to realize, like, Google around while you're talking here, like, no, these things use clearly far more energy than they're acting. And even when they're not using that much energy, they have really perverse power requirements to even remain stable.
Well,
and I think that's why we don't see anyone review. I think that's why you don't see a lot of reviews. And I think that's why you don't see a big push from Intel to get people to review them or buy them, because they just don't really seem to work. And now they've halted shipment. I know they're redoing the shipments now, but I don't know. You reaching out to me a couple months ago has spurred me to reach out to other people. And it just does seem like Sapphire Rapids costs more than we ever wanted it to, has more issues to this day than we ever wanted. And it's just kind of for Intel's closest server customers. All of their use cases kind of seem to be a mess to use these for.
Yeah. And you put it perfectly, perverse, because the perverse power requirement, I mean, it's not pulling, those enormous type of power requirements. From what we can measure, it's not doing it. There's just something in the design that's actually dropping these machines if you don't have at least a 750 watt power supply, overhead. This is on the Asus boards.
Overhead, you mean above what they should probably require, yeah.
Well, above, right? So, look, I always build machines with a nice overhead with the power supply. So even if I do all the calculations and the machine is pulling at max 400 or 500 watt, I've still got a 750 or 850 watt power supply in there, right? I've never encountered these type of situations where the things are actually just shutting themselves down unless you've got, a 1500 watt power supply in there. And the thing is, not shutting itself down immediately. Sometimes you actually have to press play. Like, it would actually fire the machine up, but as soon as you press play, now there is no CPU load on it. As soon as you do any form of processing, it was dropping the machine down, right? This is with the smaller power supply. So the Sapphire Rapids to me has been a disappointment in more than, just the performance issues we're having. The pricing, I think I was dictating, I actually did a comparative thing for you where if we were putting a 13900K and a good quality motherboard, and the CPU on the motherboard just itself would be under $1,300 in Australia. A 16-core W20 2400, which is the 2400 65X, plus the Ace motherboard is $4,300. And we're not and we're only talking single-figure percentage improvements, right?
Yeah.
Across doing the audio production stuff. To try and justify a $3,000 price variable with that performance variable is very, very difficult. And the only people that are going to be really even poking at these new machines are those that have a higher PCIe requirement, and that is quite limited because it's really the graphics cards are not the issue. It's going to be people that have multiple PCIe cards, for example, for the audio interfaces, or DSP cards. That's a really small margin, very small sector of the market, where the HEDTs before were the memory bandwidth on these machines were actually a core advantage as well, with the 4-channel DDR4, for example, on the earlier N980 or the X299s. DDR5 has pretty much leveled that memory bandwidth requirement, right? Then it's the maximum amount of memory, right?
Yeah.
So and this is where Intel and AMD differ, because we can comfortably get 4 chips into a Z790 board. 4 DDR5, we do have to clock them down a little bit, right? But we can comfortably get 4 chips. And I think we clock them down at like 4800. And they very reliable. We can get up to 128. We actually can get up to, with using 48 gigahertz, 96, 100, we can get up to 192, right? Okay, by clocking the memory down on these Z790s. Trying to run 4 chips on the AMD machines is a nightmare. You got to drop them down to about 3,400, 3,500, I think. I haven't even attempted it because I know dual channel up, and that's why I only offer up to 64 gigahertz on the
gigabytes.
AMDs.
I mean,
sorry, what did I say?
Gigahertz.
Gigabytes.
It means up to you make 64 gigabyte systems if you're using AMD.
Yeah, 64 gigabytes max for
just saving
AMD.
you from the comments.
Thank you. And 128 gigabyte for the Z790s presently, because stocks of 48 gigabyte DIMMs is pretty rare. So that with all of that, trying to sell these W2400 systems to the clients that have been waiting for them is, it's a long bow. I've shifted at least 4 of my professional clients to Z790, large Z790 machines. and they're coming in from earlier, X series systems, and they're going to be fine. It's going to be fine. I'd still like to be able to sort these W790 systems. I just can't. I can't see it with that whole.
There's a lot of things, honestly.
Yeah, I mean the design of the socket. Yeah, I mean you were mentioning they were actually thinking of putting it onto a smaller socket. Why? I mean, why couldn't
it may have been? I think I'm starting to remember. I think it may have been the same LGA count, but it was like going to be more cost optimized for cheaper motherboards, and they just never decided to make the cheaper motherboards. Basically.
Right. Okay. So
I think so, if I remember right.
I think socket 2066 with a 22 core would have been pushing it. They would have been right at the limit. And look, Intel aren't
Well, they're never going to put these on the older sockets. It would have had to have been some new, smaller socket.
And look, they're not exactly backwards in actually coming out with new sockets every 12 to 24 months on the Z series. I mean, they could have easily come up with a proprietary socket for that W2400, and that would have completely removed it from the W3400 platform. It could have been awesome. Could have been. And this is what I'm most disappointed about, because instead we've got, I'm not going to say it. I think it just feels like a clusterfuck at the moment. I don't think we're going to be able to even get an official all-core turbo resolution, and having to manage that ridiculous power requirement. That's a second one. Plus the pricing. It's just horrendous. So a comparative 3900K system with 64 gigabyte of RAM with all of my default storage options is around 4K. To get an equivalent 2465X, and this is all theoretical because none of the stuff has landed, but I did price it all up, is $8,000. So it's basically double the price. It's just almost impossible to justify, unless you need that PCIe requirement. My phone's not ringing off the hook for it. Is all I can say.
Well, that's the funny thing. So I thought 6 months ago, if you would have asked me, I would have said something like, well, maybe Sapphire Rapids will push AMD to move up Threadripper, and then like 2 weeks after that, maybe I leaked this. Like, as far as I can tell, Zen 4 Threadripper is not being rushed out at all. AMD doesn't feel like it. And I thought, oh, maybe, and I've been saying this even to recently, well, maybe it's because AMD wants to work on just good support for their server products, reducing lead times to their customers, and they don't want to launch Threadripper until they know they're getting close to like Intel lead times and support on everything. They don't see the point in doing that yet.
Yeah.
And I think that there's some truth to that. That's probably partially part of the story. But the other part of the story is, ignore what you're seeing on paper, ignore what you're seeing from fluff pieces. Once I started reaching out to people after you reached out to me, everyone says either they can't get a hold of Sapphire Rapids or it's had so many issues that they're not going to carry it. And I think AMD knows the true story on the ground. You have boots on the ground. Is Sapphire Rapids really isn't competing with them at all right now.
No.
And they'd have no worries about waiting to release Threadripper later. And that's unfortunate, because you're someone who could say it more than anyone. You wish there was something new, but there just isn't for your uses because Intel's just a basket case, and AMD doesn't feel the need to rush out a good Zen 4 system.
Yep, correct. I mean, if W2400 had actually eventuated as a true X299 replacement, look, it could have been more expensive. I mean, but just not where it landed. CPUs at least more than double the cost of what we were expecting. The motherboards are 3 times the cost of what we were expecting. That they're almost like taking the piss, So at least I've got from that internal document. I think I did actually send you that this morning, which was the kind of like a partner press release type of thing. At least I've got the face of the guy that's responsible, At least I can say, well, at least I know what you look like that's actually delivered this fantastic cluster. And then the thing that disappoints me the most is that not only that they haven't delivered with the W2400 as we expected, but I think AMD were waiting to see how this eventuated and how they landed before they made a decision on the standard
And if they
Threadripper.
want it, because look, the Zen 4 Threadripper could launch in 3 months if they wanted to. They just
Yep.
have to say go.
Yep.
And I think they were probably waiting. Do we need to launch this summer? And they
Nah.
decided no.
They don't have to do anything, you know. And look, I've seen some whispers of AMD actually asking some higher end partners via a questionnaire of how would they feel about you know, a how did they voice it? Well, I think they actually said a HEDT product, a new HEDT product, and I'm chuckling, going, well, what else would it be, right? It'd have to be the standard Threadripper. And that questionnaire was floating around maybe about 2 or 3 months ago, Tom. I don't know if you'd actually been aware of it.
No, I remember that because all the rumor websites covered that.
Did they? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I wasn't. I just got forwarded the email.
And they took that to mean, well, it must be coming out in a couple of months. And I said,
No.
People I talked to at AMD, it's not coming out anytime soon.
Yeah.
To this day, I would say there's a chance it could come out this fall, but I don't think you should bet on it. It kind of still seems like the roadmaps I saw months ago hold true. It's very end of quarter 4 or early 2025.
Yeah, I don't think they need to do anything.
Or 2024, not 2025.
Yeah, I don't think they really need to do anything. But it'd be great if it comes out, because then we could sit there and wipe this Sapphire Rapid like a dirty rag. And this is coming from someone who's supposedly, I was, Intel focused and biased for the last 20 odd years, and I'm not. I'm actually I'm a solutions provider, and I'm focused on providing solutions that are going to be giving me the best option to deliver the product without constantly having to sit there and navigate support or incompatibilities and that type of stuff. And that's where I always would lean more to the Intel. And there's still some little weird quirks with my current AMD systems. We don't have to cover that, but I did tell you a couple of them.
But you say they're getting better, and they used to be of non-consideration, and they do get better and better.
Well, I'm offering AMD machines for the first time in 20 plus years, right? So
that tells you something. Yeah.
So the Ryzens are great, but there are some caveats, and I'm aware of them, and I know where the bodies are buried. And so, when the clients are coming to me and saying, I need a Ryzen system, and the first thing I say is, okay, what kind of audio interface do you have? What kind of protocols do you require? Do you have any DSP cards, PCIe, all of that type of stuff? And I qualify them, and I'll go, right, okay, I think you're going to be cool, And there'll be AMD people listening and going, "What's he talking about?" I'm like, "Well, these people are dealing with one machine. I'm dealing with multiple, and a whole plethora of different audio interfaces and hardware devices that all have to work perfectly." Because I'm only a one-man operation, I can't afford to be sitting there and circumnavigating weird-ass compatibility problems. If you know what I mean. So that's where I'm at, and the AMDs are they are far better in regards to compatibility. So I'm happy to do those. I'm not.
It does sound like for you, it's really Zen 4 though that's made AMD really be a good option.
100%. Zen 4, with the integrated graphics, that was more than fine for the DAWs. I mean, I don't mind actually throwing, third-party graphics cards if it is required, but it was Zen 4 that actually tipped me. And with the DDR5 and the improvements in the IPC, everything as a total package, they were a great type of addition to what I've been offering. And they're equally as popular as the Intel machine, so I'm happy with that. So that's fine, But I'm not going to be sitting there, ranting that these things are, the best thing since sliced bread. I mean, the thermal footprints of the 7950. I mean, the first time I've had to been required to actually water cool my systems, whether it was the 7950 and the 13900K, both of them pushing these envelopes into these pushing the thermal envelopes into areas where we've never really needed to actually
I don't think that's
navigate.
going away. Intel pushed things to 300 watts, and then AMD said, well, we might as well at least go to
Yeah,
170. And I think writings on the wall, they're all going to be pushing 170 to 250 watt
yeah.
CPUs forever.
It's more the thermal. It's more the thermal footprints that these things are leaving. So like the seven Ryzen 7000s would immediately, as soon as you put any type of load, would immediately go to 95 degrees. I'm like, whoa, hang on, what's going on there? And then we discovered it was these power and clocking profiles that the motherboard manufacturers have been a little bit over exuberant with, and then AMD just saying, "Oh
Well,
no,
I
they're
mean,
designed to do that."
it's built to do that. There is a difference. I've had products where they're unstable above 90 degrees, and I've had products where they're actually built to go to 100 and they're fine.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I think that's another conscious decision of like, if we can push it 5 more degrees and build the silicon to be stable there, we can squeeze another 2% performance out,
yeah. But you know that whole profile is easily remedied, very very easily remedied. I mean, they
Mhm.
have a thing called eco mode where you could actually run the AMDs at a lower power rating, but you don't. You just run it at the designated power rating, and the actual thermal dynamic of the chip goes back to actually scaling as per
Mhm.
load. It doesn't immediately go to 95. It actually just it goes and behaves normally again. So I thought that was a really weird type of decision. And then all the motherboard manufacturers had this eco mode available, which I'm thinking, well, what is that? And we just scaled the heat back on it. They're still kind of. I mean, I can manage it with a near silent water cooling system, but it, it it was a job. I'd much prefer to use air cooling on these machines because they're far more consistent, and especially when I'm deploying these machines for anywhere from 7+ years,
Yeah.
water cooling systems aren't going to last that long, Tom. They're going to start getting grumpy and noisy, and I don't know where the tipping point's going to be. Is it going to be 3 years? Is it going to be 5 years? So I'm expecting some phone calls in the future that.
Yeah, I mean, at least water cooling systems, I'll say, in the past 3 years are significantly more reliable than the 10 years ago, the all-in-ones that people used to buy, that
Oh
those
yeah,
things always crapped out in 3 years. They
yeah,
don't seem to anymore. Like, they've
yeah,
finally gotten decent.
yeah, yeah.
Um, this summer, Jesse's excited to lay back and, well, if we are being honest, try to get some of my friends and family to give them their hamburgers, hot dogs, and noodles while we're making dinner and having cookouts. Which, honestly, I don't think she even really cares that much about which piece of human food she gets, whether it's healthy or not. But that's where me and her differ, because I do care. The older I get, the more I notice the healthier I eat, the better I feel, and that's why I eat Vite Ramen. This piece of content is brought to you by Vite Ramen. Vite Ramen is a healthy, tasty, and shelf-stable food crafted by an American startup that offers a ton of options for eating healthy, like their classic packages that make it easy to add protein and other ingredients of your choice, and the Ramen Go packages that offer a healthy, microwavable option for those who truly only have a 15-minute lunch break, whether at the office or working from home. Click on the link in the description and use the offer code BROKENSILICON to save 10% off a variety of different products, including special bundles just for Moore's Law Dead fans, raw nudes if you want to make up your own recipe with these noodles, and other food products and cooking utensils as well. And remember that no matter what you get from Vite Ramen, if you use the link in the description and the offer code, you are supporting Moore's Law is Dead, in addition to supporting this plucky and rapidly growing company. So support Moore's Law is Dead by supporting Vite Ramen today. You know, I want to ask you something though. So you're so used to basically only offering Intel for so much time. How do you, and you talk to people at Microsoft and Intel, and I'm sure you think about this just in your spare time, just as someone who was pretty much an only or predominantly Intel seller for so long. How do you feel about the company right now? Like, just in general, and like, where do you think, how do you feel? Yeah. How do you feel about the health of the company and their future?
I might start spraying some expletives, Tom. I think they're in trouble. I think I don't like the hybrid chip design. I never liked the hybrid chip design, and they seem to be investing even more in that type of paradigm, So are you trying to tell me that they can't get any more than 8 performance cores into that die package? I mean, seriously? 8 performance
It
cores
just
is the
seems to
max?
be a decision. I'll say this. I know. So there's the Royal Core project created by Jim Keller to like move past their existing architecture. They've basically been married to
Yep.
for the past 15 years. And as a part of that, we have Arrow Lake coming out soon. We have Lunar Lake, Nova Lake, maybe on that one. And then there's these things I'm hearing about, like Cougar Cove and Beast Lake. These are all part of this Royal Core family of like solutions Jim Keller came up with to get massive IPC increases. And, we've seen them make ring bus designs that go up to 12 cores before. And I mean, heck, just for anyone who's wondering, like all big cores, Broadwell E was 10 cores,
Mm,
they had that. You could have bought that. And fundamentally, they can still do that now. But from what I've heard is there's some Royal Core, I think Beast Lake was one of them, designs years from now, if this ever even comes out, that were like up to 10 cores. So I see them playing around with 10 big cores and then who knows how many little cores. In the coming years, but I don't really see them playing around with 12 or more than that. I just, unless it's a server or workstation chip,
yep.
I don't see it. Everything seems to be driving for 8 cores and maybe 10 in a few years, but that's
Yep.
it.
Yep. And that's the disappointment for me, because I'd much prefer just all straight out performance cores like the Ryzens. And I couldn't give a seriously, I couldn't give a shit about the economy cores. But the thing, and then I will say this though, when they say economy cores, it's very different to the Apple Silicon big little, right? Because the
Hmm.
little cores on Apple, they can't do anything. I mean, you can't have any type of processing. You can't have any thread priority landing on those cores. There's no way. And I've spoken to some developers where when they were initially writing some native code, that they were running into problems where the threading was actually landing on those cores by mistake. So with the Intel though, and again, we're bringing in this thread director thing. The applications have no direct control over the thread director. They can't actually communicate with it. It's all on thread priorities. So it's all a bit of a guessing game to me. And look, for the most part, and this is what I've been witnessing with as we are progressively and incrementally actually loading these DAWs up to the nth degree and watching how the core management works. The specific DAWs are actually behaving differently, and some of them will more predominantly load the P cores first, and then once we get to about a moderate load onto the P cores, then the E cores start getting loaded with the same multi-thread type of processing. Right, it's not a background or foreground type of process. They're all kind of foreground and proprietary processing. And overall, the performance of those E cores are not horrible. I
Hmm.
think they're saying, did they say it was around an 8th gen, somewhere like that? So,
Well, yeah, that was something I kind of broke too. Is like I started like reverse engineering some of the documents I have and the projected performance, and like you'd say, and it does it does depend on the application though, because really the E cores are meant to be used piggybacking on at least 2 big cores handling things for multi-threaded stuff. So the closest comparison you would make is the Alder Lake E cores, and I guess Raptor Lake would be the same. It's basically Skylake or maybe slightly better than Skylake
mm,
IPC, but they
yep,
don't clock to 5 gigahertz, at least not yet. So they're not really as good. Also, they don't have hyperthreading. So the closest comparison you'd make is it's Skylake if it was clocked lower with no hyperthreading. That's about where they are. But that still seems to be like a caveat of if you were to actually only have one E core, it tends to, in a lot of single threaded applications, lose to Skylake. But in multi threading, the E cores actually, if you had 4 Gracemont E cores, 4 Skylake cores without hyperthreading. Actually, in multi-threading, they're better but
yeah,
that's what they're meant to do is to handle multi-threading workloads and
yep.
background tasks. They're not meant to like run a game. like an
Well,
i5.
this is where you're saying background task. This is not the way that they're actually being hit and utilized
No, I know,
in
but
multi-threading
they, you know,
media creation applications. They are being utilized as a foreground proprietary
and
task.
if you're
Right?
using them all at once, it's the equivalent of Skylake cores if they didn't have hyperthreading, is what I'm
Right.
saying.
So
But if there was only one of them by themselves, there's a latency penalty where actually it might be worse. But
right.
I hope you see what I'm saying.
But the performance we're seeing is that the 13900K and the 7950 in DSP, the 7950 actually has an advantage, as it should, because it's 16 true performance cores. But in the virtual instrument test, they're almost on par, right?
Mhm.
Which is kind of pretty amazing when you think that we've got only 8 performance cores and then the 16 little ones. So just in summary,
Well,
they're not
it
those
depends how
equal.
you frame it, though, right? Because the little cores sound good if you call them little, but in reality,
They're not
AMD's
little.
Zen
They're not
exactly.
really.
AMD's Zen 4 cores are, I think, half the size of a big core for Raptor, like at least half the size.
Yeah,
And from that perspective, you go, well, wait a second. So an E core is a fourth the size of a P core, but Intel's P cores are twice as big as AMD's cores, anyways.
yeah,
So, I mean, AMD's cores have hyperthreading. You could you would argue that AMD has managed to compete with 16 middle cores compared to Intel.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it
yeah,
actually works out about where you expect.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I was expecting um, with the W2500, I was expecting the 16 uh, performance cores to actually absolutely lay waste to the 13900K, and it just didn't happen. It just
Hmm.
did not happen, and that has something to do a little bit with clock as well. But it is very disappointing that you've got the new architecture. There's thermally they're running at ridiculously low temperatures. I mean, they're seriously, Tom, they're running at mid 50s, right?
Hmm.
At 4.4 gigahertz. There's plenty of headroom thermally. It's not the thermal footprint that's actually the problem. There's something else going on that is not allowing them to clock into that 5 gigahertz range. Look, I see the potential there, but I'm not holding out any faith that they're actually going to fix this, because that package, die package, has actually committed them to a completely different price point and platform. So, look, good. All I can say to Intel is good luck with them. I'm very, very disappointed that they didn't deliver that monolithic X299 replacement. I'll deal with it. Look, and I even had a bit of a chuckle where I was reading that they're planning on a refresh.
Yeah, maybe
Refresh.
two. Yeah.
Yeah, good on them. Good luck. They've. I think they should just. I don't know. They can't just ditch the whole thing, can they, Tom? I just.
Well, maybe the refresh will be the actual push, and that we'll have to see. I know this refresh is going to be more than just a normal refresh for Sapphire Rapids. I hope I'm not misremembering, but I think I remember one of my Intel contacts telling me a few weeks ago that like this Sapphire Rapids refresh is actually really like Raptor like R, which is really a gen and a half newer than what's in Sapphire Rapids right now.
Okay.
So maybe it might have some very fundamental fixes. And maybe there's a reason they're not supplying a bunch to Australia and everybody else. Maybe it's because they're like, yeah, this is a basket case, but this gen and a half later version we're going to throw out will actually fix all the issues. That's when we do the marketing and push, because this one will actually work.
Yeah.
And maybe that'll come out half a year before Threadripper, and it'll actually have that narrow time in the sun to shine that AMD isn't taking advantage of right now.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of ifs, and maybes there.
I agree. Intel is the company of ifs. I mean,
Uh,
what do you want me to say?
yeah. So,
All right.
was there anything else that you wanted to chat about?
Well, if you have like another 10 minutes or so, I thought
Yeah.
I'd throw a final few audio questions for you. That might be
Sure.
fun. Bfish writes in and he asks, "Hi, Tom and Vin. Question for Vin. I've been running optical audio into a DAC with a mini amp and some bookshelf speakers, and they sound okay. but I really can't tell much of a difference from the $25 Sound Blaster speakers I was running before. Is it the equipment or me?
Probably a combination. If he's running digital outs into a separate a DAC. It
Mm-hmm.
comes down to the converters, right? So, the Sound Blaster running into the speakers. It's a difficult question to answer because I don't know what speakers he's talking about, right?
Right, just because it has optical audio doesn't mean they're good speakers. And I would also say, I don't know what sound card you're using. Is this because some motherboards have some really cheap sound cards, and for
Yeah,
all I know, there's
but
something with that as well.
he's bypassing the D to A converters on the card by using the digital. So he's going digital out into a third-party digital audio converter, right? DAC. That's
Mm-hmm.
that, and so that bypasses the onboard sound card completely. From my understanding of the question, he's saying he's not hearing that much difference between the third-party DAC that he's connected digitally, and the cheap Sound Blaster going out analog. If he's
Probably using a 3.5 millimeter,
yeah, that's got to come down to the speakers. It has to come down to the speakers. And so if you were to ask me, is there a difference between the quality of the onboard sound cards and a prosumer or professional audio card? It definitely is. And but it still comes down to you need a listening environment, and those prosumers and the professional cards and the speakers, the studio monitor speakers, they're not going to be designed to give you a hyped sound. They're designed to give you a very flat sound,
Mm-hmm.
a very flat sound, so that when you do mix your music, that it can actually be reproduced on a whole stack of different speaker systems, from earpods to desktop speakers to hi-fi stereo and stuff. So if he's not hearing it, it comes down to
There's so many more variables though, too.
it comes down to a human element. The human element is your hearing. So there's not necessarily anything wrong by him saying, hey, I've got a DAC and I'm going out with my Sound Blast, I'm not hearing the difference. But if he's going through the same speakers, I think the limitation is probably the speakers.
Well, I think he has a different set of speakers here, but I just don't know exactly which model and where it's plugged into on the PC,
Right.
and I can say, like, what I have right now is I have an Asus motherboard, and it actually came with a sound card built for the motherboard that's like, kind of the size of a big NVMe SSD. It
Right.
slots in there. That has an optical out directly through it that I'm using to a high-end Yamaha soundbar that's actually fairly new for desk use. And I can say the difference between the sound of that and then a cheap motherboard and Sound Blasters, which is just a cheap brand of speakers, kind of, is night and day. It sounds
Yeah.
night and day better, but I have to make sure I'm using the right port on my motherboard. If I were to use, well, I guess I actually don't have one on my desktop, but I don't care because I would never use it. But if I were to use one of those front port 3.5 millimeter audios, that might be bypassing your sound card or something. And like, you have to make sure the file you're playing / the medium to the sound card to the cable to the speaker are all in the correct order and line, or one of them might be a cheap component you don't realize you're using over the other expensive
Yeah.
thing,
Well,
right?
when you're connecting the 1/8, that's going through your cards, analog to digital converters, all right?
Mm-hmm.
Where how you've connected your soundbar via your digital I/O, that's completely bypassing the analog digital converters of your audio
Mm.
card and using the analog to digital converters on your soundbar. So that's it. I mean, there are so many variables. So I mean, it's a difficult question to respond to, because I'm trying to, if he's saying that he's using the same speakers and he's not hearing much difference between, like, the 1/8 unbalanced connections, right?
No, he's using some different bookshelf speakers, so some bigger ones with bass. but
Right.
probably two of them.
Yeah. But look, if the difference is between, the onboard card and the DAC, again, I don't know which DAC it is,
Hmm.
you can, and again, mate, the whole discussion about hearing the difference between audio conversion, unless it's really bad, there's not an enormous difference between, say, for example, a $300 to $500 $300 to $500 prosumer card
Hmm.
and a $1,500 card, because they are using the same family of digital audio converters. Where you're going to get the difference with some of those audio interfaces is in the other peripheral stuff, like mic preamps, for example. There might be a higher quality mic preamps involved. This is not something that you're going to be dealing with outside of the audio production type of stuff. So
Hmm.
with just listening, it comes down to the digital audio converters, and there are different qualities of those. Like even MP3 players, for example. I'll give you a perfect example. The iPods. Everyone loves the iPods, right? And you're listening to the iPods even through their little, the tiny 1/8 into your whatever you're playing into. I listen to the stuff in the car, for example. And if you compare that, to example, to an old Zune, remember the Zunes?
Yes.
You're chuckling. I've still got two of them, right? Brilliant. It's absolutely night and day, because the digital analog conversion on the Zunes was miles better
Mm.
than the Apple product, and it's not something that is even subtle. And we're still talking about highly compressed MP3s, and even with that, the difference is absolutely night and day. So that's what it comes down to, the actual quality of the DAC, and then it comes down to the speakers as well.
Now, I almost doubt this is what it is, but another dumb thing I'd throw at B-Fish is in the window, if you go into Windows Sound and then like right click on the thing, this is especially an issue, by the way, with mics.
Yep.
The format you're sending it in might be some old compressed, cheap output, like the I'm forgetting the kilobit, not kilobit per second really, but it might be that. But like what frequency you're sending the signal in, it might be using some old compressed thing, and you might need to enable. Right, like that's an issue I've had with my mic. That I had an old Shure mic where it would just default to this low sample rate. That's what I was looking for the
Right.
mic. And it would just keep defaulting to it. And I'd have to make sure before I started recording something that I set it to thousands, tens of thousands higher sample rates. And that's a kind of a thing with output as well with an audio, is if you're not outputting the high quality rate, then it's going to sound compressed, because it is, you
Yeah.
know.
Well, it should. I mean,
It should. It
Windows
should.
defaults to 48K.
Hmm.
I tend to run 44.1 on mine, because it's the old school CD format, and there's not a lot of difference between 44.1 and 48, where 48 is the sample rate that defaults to video, for example,
Hmm.
right? Um, but
Right, and I
Windows,
found weird issues rendering videos and exporting them if I don't do 48,
yeah, it's got to be
because
48. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. So, yeah, it shouldn't be. So what
I
was it
don't think
drop?
it's
What was
that,
it
but
dropping down to? Like 22 kilohertz or something?
I don't remember. I don't remember. It
It
was
would have
lower
sounded
than that
pretty
even.
crunchy.
Oh, it did. There's a
Yeah.
guys, just forgive me with my old Shure mic. Um, this was in 2021. Every now and then there'd be a video where I sound a little robotic. That's why I
Oh,
forgot to check that.
that's probably, yeah, that has to be the driver of the so the Shure mic. You don't have an audio interface. You're plugging that directly in via USB, correct? The USB mic.
The old one, yes. This one, no. This one, I do have an audio
You have an audio
interface, actually,
interface. Okay.
and the issue's gone away because it defaults correctly now.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
That'd come down to the driver, the quality of the
yeah.
driver. Yeah. Yeah. So there you go.
All right.
Yeah.
Tillex100 writes in. He says, when looking at mainboard spec sheets, I always wonder if the advertised sound chips do actually sound different from each other. Should I consider the quality of the sound chip that's included in a motherboard as someone that wouldn't spend extra on a sound card or external equipment. I'm wondering, I'm guessing this question for you is a little goofy because you're just always going to do an add-on sound card for most people, but
Yep.
are there things you look for in the integrated sound cards in a motherboard ever that you would say there's a difference between them?
Oh, Tom, I don't even look at the spec. You know, and I bet you the spec is all very similar to all of those cards. And again, it comes down to the DAC, you know, the digital audio converter. Um, look, I haven't looked at the specs of those onboard audio cards in, you know, can't even remember. You know,
Hmm.
I use it. I use them on my office machine. But again, it's not a critical
Right.
listening environment for me. So not a question I can answer only because it's just the first thing I do with any
Yeah,
motherboard
you're
is
all or nothing. You're going for a great sound card or it's all junk anyways.
I disable the onboard, except for the laptops, obviously, because it doesn't give us that capability on modern laptop motherboards. BIOSes. It doesn't allow us to disable the onboard audio. Um,
Hmm.
and again, you know, then on the laptops you're listening to the onboard audio through laptop speakers. So it's like, no. So it's not a question that I'm only because I'm not really. It's not an area that I focus on, unfortunately.
Clean Sweep writes in and he says, "Hey, Tom and Vin, what kind of audio features would you want Microsoft to integrate into Windows 11 and onwards, both for audio production and consumption? Personally, I would love for Windows audio drivers to have a universal equalizer tuner with a few useful presets like dialogue enhancement. It'd be nice to not have to reinstall Alan Benatti's custom audio drivers just to get those quality of life features every time I update my GPU audio driver."
Right. Um, what kind of features would I like to see
Integrate
Microsoft
into Windows 11,
integrated?
yeah.
Well, I mean, Microsoft have never had a universal low latency latency driver. Not that it actually, not one that actually competes against ASIO. Now, ASIO is a protocol, low latency driver protocol that was developed by Steinberg in the late 90s, and it's still the predominant driver. And so where Mac, for example, had core audio.
Mhm.
Um, Windows does not have a native low latency driver. I know that's something that Pete um, is on the, I suppose, the agenda or to-do list. I don't know if it'll ever eventuate, but that's something that it would be great if they could do it. But I think it's too late. The other thing that's actually being implemented is at the API level is actually MIDI 2. So MIDI 2 is the new protocol, the new enhanced protocol from the MIDI protocol. So, uh, you know, is that a wish? That's coming, right? So MIDI 2 is coming.
Yeah.
But as far as audio features with EQs and what the other chap was talking about, no, again, no, not
You're
really.
probably gonna end up using custom things anyways,
Yeah,
right?
look, I
So
mean, I live in, but any of that type of level of listening, or I'm not in just a standard Windows environment. I'm in a DAW environment, so it's kind of, again, it's another difficult question for me to answer. I apologize, but it's not that's not something that I'm focused on, and I don't think it's um, it's not something that I necessarily want Microsoft to
to comment
focus
on
on.
or
Yeah,
yeah, or no.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
All right, well, that's the rest of the questions. I don't know if there was anything else you wanted to discuss. I mean, you certainly gave us a lot of your time here, and we got to the core of the thing with Sapphire Rapids I definitely wanted to cover.
Yeah. No, look, I'm fine, Tom. And thanks for having me on. I know we kind of rabbited on a little bit there. That was actually me rabbiting on, but it was good that we could at least, discuss the issue surrounding that release.
A
Yeah,
lot of people at Intel and AMD may not, their marketing department certainly doesn't want to talk to me, but they the engineers, a lot more of them than you'd think are listening,
yeah,
and so I'm imagining some of them will reach out into the email after this. We'll see.
yeah. Well, look, the thing is that if you're reading between the lines with all of the official documents that got released to the product partners,
Hmm.
um, there was, the elephant in the room omission was, where's the listing for the all-core turbo? Right? So I missed it the first time I read through it. I went, hang on. They've very specifically not listed the all-core turbo.
Mm-hmm.
And the only time, and then they were confronted with it, and then they're scrambling around trying to come up with some. Oh no, that's it. So, and we've asked a question about, well, how did this guy? How come this undocumented setting in the ASUS motherboard leaves the core multiplier exactly where it is, but we're getting the turbo, all-core turbo up above 4 gigahertz? How is that even possible? Right? That's the questions I want answered, And the thing is that my concern is that if we push ASUS too hard, that they'll delete that setting, because I don't think it's non-official, right? No one's actually admitting that it's even there, which is the most bizarre type of thing. And did I send you I'm not sure if I sent you the link to that that overclocking document where I actually found out about this hidden setting. If I haven't, I'll send it to you. DeBauer, what was his name?
DeBauer.
DeBauer.
Yeah, DERBAU, and then I think there's an ATR. There's an A
that's
there.
the one. That's the one. So that's a pretty in-depth article, but there's been no follow-up, which is interesting. And that was like March, April, maybe. I just still find it bizarre that we're in July and there is no reviews. Usually all of these tech sites are all over this stuff,
I'll tell you what, I reached out to one of them. I won't say which one. And a person who works there says it mostly comes down to Intel isn't giving them out. Like AMD, when a new Threadripper comes out, they will send Threadrippers to people. Chips. Intel isn't really doing that. And on top of that, Intel's cost more than ever. So if you're a review website, I mean, honestly, it might just be bad business unless you're like enormous to buy like a $10,000 system over doing other videos that cost nothing and will get you the same amount of clicks. Not to mention, a lot of them, this person also said, they're worried they wouldn't do it proper justice. Like they're worried it'd be such an undertaking that they wouldn't do a good job and it would expose them to looking stupid. So I know that's mostly what it is, but I would agree. Like, I'll even just say, I wish, like, Hardware Unboxed did extensive Threadripper and extreme Intel testing, and I wish Hardware Unboxed, Gamers Nexus, come on, man, test Sapphire Rapids. Where are the chips? Where is the testing? Even if it's just for gaming, tell us, is this happening?
Yep, even our friend, starts with an L, that is pretty much self-funded,
Oh, yeah, Linus Tech Tips?
Yeah, Linus.
They could afford to, like, some very in-depth,
Easily. But again,
think how much effort it would take. How much is this going to cost versus another video?
They revel in it, Tom. I mean, some of the stuff that I've seen him with his
I know, they have the money.
Tech mode. They revel in it. So there's something else going on. But anyway, we'll see how all this fleshes out. If you get any emails from the Intel or the ASUS engineer saying, we're going to be actually resolving this all-core turbo area, that'd be nice. I'm not holding my breath. No.
Yeah, I think we've kind of come to the conclusion the big push is probably going to be the refresh, if I had to guess. I think that is my suspicion at this point.
The refresh. And then we've got the
fixed version.
We've got the Raptor Lake refresh coming in October, apparently. That was the new leak this morning. Did you see that one?
Well, yeah. It is always going to come out around then, though.
Yeah.
It's actually a little later than I would hope if that is when it ends up coming out. But remember, all these CPUs, Raptor Lake, the original Raptor Lake, not the sequel, Alder Lake, they all had rumors for when they were coming out, and then they typically get moved up or back about a week or two. So I would still just keep it as end of Q3, early Q4.
Yeah,
That's
Q3.
when the stuff's coming out.
Well, that's traditionally when they do their releases,
Yeah.
The X series releases are always end of Q2 or Q3, and they'll, or some of them edged into Q4, but it's usually in that second half of the year, so there was a 3-year cadence. and that was always in the second half of the year. So yeah, they're going to get in early for Christmas, I suppose.
All right. Well, I think on that note, though, I'm going to call it an evening. I guess it's actually noon where you are in the Upside Down.
12:30. The wife kind of looked through my office window and just gave me the roll of the eyes going, are you still talking?
Well, I'll spare you a fight then.
No, it's okay. It's all good.
But please tell everybody where they can find you, though, because I know you have a podcast and your website. So if anyone is interested in what you do, they can find you.
Well, the podcast is just, if you just type in Dawbench Radio Show, so DAWBENCH Radio Show, or dawbench.com, that's like a landing page where it just links you to my Facebook and the podcast. And the company is Avum Technology. That's
AAVIMT.com.au.
Yeah, that's for the Australian listeners. You can actually go check out the website there. But that's pretty much it, I think. We have covered a lot, Tom.
All right. Well, then let me do my final plugs that I always ramble at the end here.
Yes.
Remember to subscribe to Moore's Law is Dead. Ring the bell button. Remember to subscribe to Broken Silicon on a podcast app of your choice. Check out our sponsors and do check out the Patreon as well. There's early ad-free Broken Silicons, the ability to ask guests like Vin here questions. And there's also die shrink videos that are over an hour long every other week just for patrons. You know, you're basically getting either a bonus Broken Silicon or extended video every other week in addition to, and there's free questions for loose ends, the Discord. There's a lot of content out there if you can spare $2 a month. But otherwise, thank you again for coming on, Vin. Thank you to everybody for listening. And I don't know. Have a good week, everybody.
Yep. Cheers, mate.
This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, it's not just me. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, renders being done by the industrial designer Jean-Philippe Clermont, and special assistance is also provided by Carmen Cry and Carrie Nosugada as well. Find all of our information at www.mooreslawsdead.com on the About/Support page. In the event you do want to hire me for consulting work, hire Gerard for audio work, hire Jean-Philippe for industrial design work, or you're interested in working with Carbon Cry or Carrie Nosugada as well. You can also find our long-term sponsors on that page if you want to show them some love for putting food on our tables. Or you can also mail us some love. You can send letters or hardware donations to the following address: Moore's Law is Dead, P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. Although, to be honest, the best way to show Moore's Law is Dead some love is to support us on Patreon. Patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content truly possible. Every month, and really every day, depending on who you're talking about, me, Gerard, Dan, and Jean-Philippe are working tirelessly to provide a steady stream of content that we could not keep doing unless we knew the work was possible without being reliant on sponsors dictating every little thing we put out. Don't get us wrong. We love our sponsors, but we love directly working for you, our fans, much more. If you have any extra money, even a couple free dollars a month, consider supporting us directly on Patreon. Those couple of monthly dollars will get you access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to ask guests questions, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who I am sure would love to meet you. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to early, ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the ability to ask questions in all Broken Silicon episodes and Loose Ends live streams ahead of the recording, and the entire back catalog of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, in addition to having thanks in the credits of videos and podcasts depending on the tier, with other perks available as well. And hey, If you cannot afford to support us directly every month, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family, and on social media and websites like Reddit. And give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast app of choice. All of this does really help us so much. But, like I said, this podcast would not be possible without the patrons directly providing predictable and reliable support every month. And so now, it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher supported levels: Brad Medlin, Drita Foles, Z Jits, Daniel D, Aaron Close, Jan Rauner, Daniel Hyde, Brian Riggleman, Sam Miller, MJB1, Deke, GZ Ziggy, SNES Chalmers, Jem Ferriera, Andrew S, Falco Malev, General Drips, Jensen Wang, Nathan Mose, Eric Jackson, Sarcastro, Evan Dingle, Greg Wanchek, Chris Rich, Nicholas Buckner, Benjamin Cannon, Jonathan, Jesse Jeskowiak, 3DS Boy 08, Hal Booma, Blake, Art4Room.com, Franco Frederic, Shredbird, Dr. Foreman, Jake223, Jake Martin, Zlicky, Ricky Tan, Christopher A. Butler, Stefan Hart, Meat and Pork, Stu, Tim Robb, Ian Clifford, Travis Gooding, Nanyan, Sammy Malas, Deepest Learners, Mad, Zutsu Taylor, Stephen Coates, Michael McGee, Greg, Patrick Gross, Stefan, Jordan Simkovic, Amiable Chief, Win Wang, Tommy, Mark Mitchell, Julian Leak, I Should, Mark Rainmaker, The Boss Haas, James Anderson, Cole Addict, Judson N, Cameron, Wesley Sager, Henry Zhang, Michelle Pell, D31337 Antics, Roger Davies, Cameron, Hexapuma, Chrysantine, Meyer Tech Rants, Reginald Ari, Teak Autumn, Jackson Miller, Greg S. Acker, Neith Zink, The Eternal Dreamers, JSMMH, Damon Since Reagan, Jeff Sedler, AWS Danny, Loophole 35, Windstar, James I. Rader, Corey Leonard, Little Germany, Shay, Milton, Pulse Media, Dave Schultz, Mac Daffy, Stephen Dick, Chuck Glidden, Brett Jones, Austin Haggerty, Justin Bussell, I7, 11700K, Joe Foote, Hardland, Slushboss, Seas2, Jansen Angima, Joseph Kelly, Samuel Park, Keith Moore, Him Segung, Tails 2299, Brian Wright, John Sifos, Ertoros, The Forbidden Juice, Fenty CZ, Kiko Sato, Toka, RB Racer, Me, Val Verga, AC, Colin Tedards, Lord Starscream, Michael Cozy, Dr. J Med, Alex Vega, Freedy, John Swin, Ronan BC, Terminal Junkie, Brian Wright, Jed Baldwin, Joe LaMartina, Kikum, Albert Gunn, Solarized 80, Christopher Ricks, Jamie Whitworth, and of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.